Thank you for joining us here on Extra Innings, where we field questions from you. And so just remember, as you're sitting there listening to the sermon, just to jot down any questions or anything you'd like for Pastor to clarify, and we'll just dive into those each week as we sit down to just kind of recap and sometimes we even get to look ahead as to what's next. So thank you for tuning in, like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Before I jump into these questions, we've had enough time now to cover a good bit. Do you feel like there's anything that I guess overarching that God's speaking to our church, to our community?
I think what we touched on last week, the idea of assimilation, desperation, isolation, confrontation. I think those are important. In our context, the choices that we have to make when we're confronted with a culture, society that is against our Christian values and how we respond to that. And I think that's something we're going to be facing in the next couple of months and years in America as we are moving to a post-Christian culture. And I think the examples that we find in Esther give us some insight, because if those are the wrong examples, then what is our response? And we're going to get to that as we move into Esther chapter 4 and 5 and begin to see how Mordecai and Esther deal with this death sentence that's been placed on them. In this past week we kind of took a break, but brought some similarities between the Passover and the crucifixion, since we're in Holy Week and we were on Palm Sunday, and how that related to the death sentence that they were under in Esther, and how God provided an avenue of escape from that death sentence, ultimately in Jesus Christ on the cross. But I think there's similarities. I think it goes back to the providence of God that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, that we have these types in the Old Testament. When I say types, I mean symbolism, things that point towards something in the New Testament. And Passover and Jesus Christ are the ultimate type. But I think even in Esther we have a type of understanding God's confronting death and how he confronts death. And so I think it's great for us to step back and see that all throughout the Old Testament, God had a plan. It's one seamless story. From the garden to the crucifixion and the resurrection, God's plan was being revealed through each of these stories, and how he was going to do that. In Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, he really talks about that, looking back on the temple, looking back on Passover, and looking back on all the things that God established that were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And I think even as we look at Esther and this death sentence and how they were condemned to die and how they were to respond to that, gives us some insight into God's plan moving forward.
Right. I think the literary term is like foreshadowing. Right?
Foreshadowing. That's pointing towards.
Yeah.
And it helps us unpack even more the power of what takes place at the cross. When you look at Jesus' sacrifice and you look at how that takes place in the context of Passover, it really unlocks some things that maybe you don't see when you just read through that passage, or through those passages of Jesus' persecution and his death and what he faced.
Right.
And so I think, and there's many more besides that. We have the church and the temple or the tabernacle. We have other things that are types that help reveal some instance. And I think Esther is a type of what's going to be facing in a culture that is hostile towards Christians, just as they were hostile towards the Israelites.
Yeah, that's a cycle that seems like God's people go through, whether it be the Jewish or Christians today. We're constantly faced with these trials. So the first question that I've got here is got to do with. It's got to do with the context of worship for the Jewish believers during this time. What did that look like? Were they able to go to a temple? Was it like a home church, a house church? I mean, how did that look?
Well, the temple's destroyed until it's being rebuilt under Nehemiah, and then it's finally rebuilt under Herod. So there's no sacrifices. There's no high holy days where they come and they offer sacrifices, or they come and do the various temple routines. And so many people believe that during this time is when the synagogue system arose. And the synagogue is more what we would call house churches. It was the local group of Jewish people that still read the Torah, and they still, quoted the different prayers and the different songs, and they still met. They just did it on a more local level instead of in Jerusalem at the temple. And it's from this exile period that we begin first to see the synagogue system rise up. It takes root right around the time of Christ, where you're beginning to see it in all over local areas, people, Jews gathering in community. Now, there's nothing that tells us that Mordecai or Esther participated in that kind of system until the end of the book. You get to the end of the book when the death sentence has been lifted and it's kind of been switched onto Haman, and then the Jews revolt all over the Persian Empire, killing those who were getting ready to kill them. And then they established the Feast of Purim. And it talks about in chapter 9 and 10 this idea of them gathering to celebrate this feast. Well, there's not a temple.
Right.
So where are they gathering? Well, they're gathering in their local communities, in their tabernacle. So that even though they were isolated and they're living in an exile period, in a hostile culture, they still had some gatherings, and we even know in Susa and in Egypt and some of these other communities where the Jews fled to after the destruction of the temple, Solomon's temple, that the Jews most of the time lived in segregated communities. So they did have, in Susa, there was a section of the community that was a Jewish quarter, and so most of the Jewish people lived there, so there was a natural community there, and so there's not an isolation where they're out on their own. They still have the community support.
So the Jewish communities, they had like a local church, and that's what the synagogue was.
Yeah, somewhat. That was where they began. It was more codified as the Pharisees and Sadducees began to take over in that role, and local priests came up, and especially after when the temple was totally destroyed in 70, when the Romans destroyed Herod's temple, and that was when the synagogue system became the main focus of Jewish worship. Until today. Okay. I mean, we still don't have a temple, so They still worship in the synagogue. But we begin to see the precursors of it in the exile period, because they don't have same thing they faced in 70, and so they still had community. And I think community was important to them. I think that when it talks about at the end of chapter 3 that the city was bewildered, I think especially the Jewish quarter, the Jewish community, and they supported one another. And just like today, the way the church is important to gather and to be to gather during difficult times, because we draw strength from one another, we draw encouragement from one another. We can go to the Scripture together, worship together, and God's always used community as a way of giving us strength. So we were never created to be on our own individualistically. Sure. And even Mordecai and Esther, I don't think are on their own, because once Mordecai repents, he goes to the Jewish leaders in the communities and begins to draw strength.
Okay, so they had Jewish community, but there wasn't like a temple that they, so
it wasn't formalized. It wasn't formalized. Yeah, in each of these areas, I think in Jerusalem, even when they go back under Ezra and Zerubbabel, they're working towards some kind of religious system before they get the temple rebuilt. Right. And so, there is some kind of community and a religious following. We'd probably call it house churches today,
right.
That sort of thing.
And then being in Holy Week, that's when Jesus went to the temple. That's kind of all that stuff.
Centralized.
But before that, Jesus was kind of going around synagogue to synagogue.
Sure. Teaching, and the synagogue system was beginning to expand, especially outside of what we call the Holy Land. He goes to Galilee to his local synagogue where his family worshiped.
Right.
When they ran him off and called him crazy when he stood up and proclaimed that he was prophetically fulfilling the Old Testament. And then you had it in Paul and Peter both on their missionary journeys. Their first stop, were at synagogues. In Rome, they go to the synagogue. They weren't really formalized, under some kind of synagogue system the way we think of it, universally today. They were more localized, but that was the gathering of the Jews where they would take the gospel to first. So Jesus, of course, but the temple was still the main until 70. The main place. Now, in Esther, there is no temple.
Yeah. Well, I guess a follow-up question. This is my own. I'm just kind of getting some clarity here. So they did teachings in the synagogues. Did they do teachings in the temples, or was that just religious rites?
They did do. There were teachings. At the different courts. There were teachings done, and but most of the time it was the religious rites.
Okay.
But that still was the main place for people to come and learn and be educated in the system. Most, the Jewish faith is grounded in home. And so it's grounded in the education of the home. So most of what the Jewish people learn takes place in the home, takes place from their parents. And so it's passed down generation to generation to generation. And so that's why even in Esther and even in the diaspora after the destruction of the first temple, they couldn't wipe out the Jewish faith because it was ingrained in the home. You can't, you can't do that until you take the education away from the home. And so I think it's a great lesson for us today, the importance of the home to passing on our faith and our belief and those kind of things.
Because even if the government comes in and says you can't meet as a church, you can still do it in your home.
Yeah, you always have it in your home. I mean, and you always can, that's how the church is prospering. It's how it's prospering in China today. It's how it's prospering in places in Africa where they've outlawed Christian worship, in Muslim prominent communities. It's still taking place in the home. Our missionaries around the world, they're meeting Christians in their homes, and they're educating their kids, and they're educating their college age students, and that's where faith is catching fire.
Yeah, you can't snuff out the light inside the home for sure. So just want to thank you for tuning in. I know we've gone for quite some time here, but jot the questions down. It helps guide the discussion, helps us know what folks are thinking. And
we'd love to see you at Easter this week in person or online if you can't. And it's opening day for baseball season. Final Four is this big week, so go Astros.
Go Astros. All right. Well, thanks for being here, and subscribe. That helps us tremendously, and we'll see you next time.